I think it's long overdue after over 30 years that we re-examine and eventually change State Statute 830G. I always like to start with things that I think most of us can agree on. First and foremost, I think we all agree that a government that governs closest to the people governs best. When you put local communities, towns, and cities and their officials in the lead, they can make decisions best for their community than a state government or certainly a federal government can. Second, I think we all agree that we need to create a housing market and a policy regime in this state that makes affordability and access to housing possible and even more likely than it is currently. Under those two standards, I think 830G is currently failing our state. First of all, it creates this adversarial relationship between communities and the state government, and a very unhappy relationship at that. Anytime when a developer can build an 100-unit complex in a single-family zone neighborhood, as is currently being proposed under 830G in my district alone, I don't think it's fair to the residents of that district, and I don't think it's a sustainable paradigm where we can have buy-in from local communities across the state. At the same time, over the last 30 years that 830G has been in place, we've actually seen poverty increase in the state. So we're not, with the laws currently on the books, we're not able to generate the upward mobility and reductions in poverty that we all want to see in the state. I think there are better alternatives by which we can put our local communities in the driver's seat, increase local control, and actually reduce housing costs and increase availability across the state. Over the last couple of years, I've introduced bipartisan pieces of legislation with Representative Ali Brennan that would try to accomplish those goals: reform 830G, increase local input, and reduce the cost of housing. 5 of those proposals include rewarding towns for allowing more naturally occurring affordable housing rather than only government housing or deed-restricted housing under the current law. Second is to create a maximum height on any building development under 830G, which is similar to what Massachusetts does in its state law. Third is to make 830G based on the total number of affordable units rather than a percentage of all the existing housing stock. One of the ways that I think 830G fails to actually increase the overall housing stock or housing availability in our communities is because it creates this kind of contradiction for localities that they're actually penalized when they allow workforce housing or middle income or lower middle income housing to be built, because in order to satisfy 830G, you need to reach a 10% threshold. And if you allow lower middle income housing to be built or middle income housing to be built that your community supports, it actually increases your denominator. And even though we would all agree that that probably makes our housing markets better, it actually creates a disincentive for towns because they get farther away from their 10% threshold under 830G. I think we should make it easier for towns to receive moratoriums under 830G. There's been towns that have been denied moratoriums under 830G, even though they're adding dozens and dozens or hundreds of affordable units in a short period of time. And finally, we should allow more 830G housing points for senior housing, for transit-oriented housing, for new residential housing in mixed-use commercial office zoned areas, and new accessory dwelling apartments as well. Are just some of the bipartisan ideas that would give towns more flexibility. I think as you step back, now these are my preferences, but as you step back, I think eventually down the line what we'd really like to see and what might actually be possible is sort of a grand bargain, a bipartisan bargain in the state on housing, where we roll back some of the mandates on our towns that are unfair to our towns and create an adversarial relationship, but also open up state policy to more middle housing and workforce housing, things like accessory dwelling units, things like residential housing units in mixed use, in commercially zoned areas. That's, I think, a paradigm that's working elsewhere in the country, whereas 830G is a very heavy-handed, all or nothing, one-size-fits-all type approach, and other proposals that are in a similar vein perhaps could create an even unhappier situation in the state. So I'm always open to a conversation. I think that when we work together across the aisle, when we put localities in charge, we get the best results. So I hope that this bill passes this year as just a first step to finally reforming 830G, putting our communities in the lead and actually reducing the cost of housing for our residents. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm happy to answer any questions.